So without further ado, I'll hand over to Gary Walpole from Swansea University, whose presentation is titled One Size Doesn't Fit All, an Insight into HGV Leaders' Practices. Thanks, Gary.
Okay, I'll share the screen, try to, and if I go to, sorry, the Mac does this, it doesn't seem to like Teams. Can everyone, is that in full screen view for everyone?
Looks good, yeah, thanks.
Okay, so this is a draft paper based on actually my PhD research, which is probably now over a year old in terms of the data, but I've got one paper in full draft, and this one is in a rough draft format. And so, yeah, would appreciate any thoughts, comments, suggestions towards the end or as we go through, particularly during the question phase. So the area I'm focusing on and the suggestion actually that I'm making is that one of the issues the UK's had over the last decade, probably over the last 2 decades, is productivity, particularly within SMEs. So to reboot productivity, I think it's important to support SMEs and looking at what we can learn from high growth firms. So the area of study for this particular paper is high growth firms set within the context of SMEs, which is a particular research interest of mine. Why is it important? Well, 60% of all private sector employment in the UK is within SMEs. In Wales, which is where my context is based, where my study was based, almost 63% of private sector employment is within SMEs, and they make up more than 99% of all firms. Interestingly, though, a very small percentage of SMEs, high growth firms as they're described, create the lion's share, as Nesta call it, of all new jobs, over 50% of all new jobs. And so there should, in theory, be something to be learned from high growth firms. I wanted to understand what the leadership practices of those high growth firms were or are. You know, what do they do that's different to help them grow? A number of studies over the last decade or so, as I've suggested, have argued that unless the UK can support SMEs to enhance productivity, then we're unlikely to address the UK productivity gap as it's described. And this paper is looking to contribute to that paucity of research around what SME leaders do, and there's very little out there on leadership studies of SMEs. So that's where this paper is making to look a contribution, specifically, as I say, around the leadership practices and leadership models that are relevant or salient to SMEs. So in terms of the methodology, almost entirely qualitative. In terms of the 9 case studies, I did collect quantitative data from them. So I asked them to complete a survey before I went out to visit on both their leadership and their innovation practices. I've got an innovation paper that's separate to this. Went out, visited, had a look round, asked them to give me a tour, for want of a better phrase, and then interviewed them and other managers on that first visit. Took a lot of photos and then interviewed them monthly over that period of a year. Once I kind of got to know them and established a bit of rapport, then it tended to be phone calls monthly. Those that were a bit more receptive, I would go out. In fact, some of them I went out to the premises 3 or 4 times. One I was actually out 5 times and kind of particularly got on with him, and he enjoyed me going out there, to be honest. So it worked for us both. Prior to that, I'd interviewed separately 20 leaders. Only 11 of those, I say only 11 of them were high growth. And same process really, went out, interviewed them, interviewed some other managers, and had a look around, took some photos and kind of recorded my thoughts, comments. And then analysed that data, and there's an awful lot of it, through a series of cross-case comparative data tables and series data tables. So the 2 areas of the lit that I'm looking at and looking to make a contribution to is the SME and high growth firm literature. So that the high growth firm lit tends to sit within the overall SMEs lit. There's not a huge amount of research on context, i.e. on specifically on SMEs generally. More recently, Burak Ok pointed out that context is incredibly important for understanding leadership and leaders' practices, and there's not huge amounts out there, so that's one area. The lit has concluded over the last 10 years that SMEs are heterogeneous. There was an assumption kind of, I suppose, in the noughties and late 90s that SMEs were one type of organization. They could be studied as one. It's not the case. But generally, more recently, research has concluded that they're quite different. So depending on size, on sector, on the structure of the SME, then they are quite different. So therefore, there's not a lot of research at all on high growth firms' leaders' practices and leadership practices, if obviously there's a top team. The high growth firm literature tends to focus on where they operate, like geographically and sector-wise, how many there are across different areas of the UK, within different sectors, how many fast growth firms, high growth firms there are, and tends to focus on how fast they're growing. Also on what they do quantitatively, i.e. do they export, do they support local markets, etc. Very little qualitative studies on high growth firms to understand what are their leaders doing differently to enable them to grow and grow at a rate that employs people. And as you can see, there's suggestions that more case study and qualitative work would be helpful, is required. In terms of the leadership lit, a huge challenge to get the leadership lit onto one slide, but I'm trying. So as you guys probably know, there's the normative lit, the leadership quarterly, mainly positivist, mainly American, mostly argue that we need a new theory that incorporates all of the post-transformational or post-heroic theories. So again, as you guys probably know, there's been a plethora of new leadership theories that have argued they're replacing transformational leadership after certainly after the dot-com and then the financial crisis, and transformational blamed largely, or some of the practice of transformation blamed for those crises. More recent meta-analysis have concluded that actually a lot of those new theories don't empirically or can't empirically be distinguished from transformational and some other theories. So an awful lot of overlap is basically what Hock and Anderson and Son argued in terms of those newer post-heroic theories. The CLS authors, mainly UK based or certainly European based, as you'd know, their argument is leadership is context dependent, so it can't be understood by simply suggesting that a study of large organizations of certain kinds, whether it be the military, whether it be FTSE or fortune companies, can be applied to others, particularly SMEs, which is where Kempster, Cope and Jackson and Parry argue. And as you know, traditional normative models of SMEs should, or leaders should, operate in this way, are described as flawed by CLS authors. And the more recent emphasis on place or context, as some would describe it, is imperative for, or CLS authors would argue. So when I looked at the lit, I came out with these kind of 7 areas or 7 models really that were distinguishable from the others. Probably 40 odd I think I started with, but then looked at the significant overlaps, and that's what that diagram or figure in the middle is trying to convey, the significant overlaps between a lot of the theories, and a lot of them agreeing, or I'd agree with Hock and Anderson and Son, significant overlaps with transformational leadership. So they were the kind of 7 I considered when looking at the empirical data collected. And that empirical data, when I compared across the different practices of the leaders interviewed and observed and described by others, I come to the conclusion there wasn't a model or theory that described the practices of any of the high growth leaders. I found what I would describe as a blended styles, and I discerned a typology. So there was 3 dominant blended styles, as I would describe them, but there wasn't, as I say, one. It was more of a contingent approach required, or explanation required, in terms of trying to describe and then present what the high growth firm leaders' practices looked like. I've got a model that I'll show you shortly. Many of the antecedents or drivers to those practices were based on their personality and their personal histories, in terms of the organisations that they come from, and the roles that they held, and the context they operated within. That made me conclude, or I got to the conclusion, that there is actually no one best way to lead. They're all high growth firms, so they were all very high performing organizations, but almost none of them had the same or operated the same leadership model. So in that respect, I'd agree with CLS authors, and I particularly like this quote: there's no single way to enact or study leadership. What did it look like then, this blend of contemporary leadership practices that I found? 3 main models or theories that was discerned: either a bias towards transactional and transactional leadership, or a bias towards, or predominantly pragmatic leadership, or a predominant distributed. But I found elements of those 3 in almost all of the high growth firm leaders studied or observed. So that's trying to display what I found. So I've got these 3 dominant styles. I've tried to, I suppose, characterize or present in this way. It was a dominant distributed, with then a pragmatic and a transformational elements within, and distributed in terms of appreciation of their own capability, that self-awareness, appreciation of power and how that operated. And I've used this particular picture from one of them because a lot of what I would describe distributed leadership through metrics and through data displays, a lot of engaging managers or supervisors in the business with the metrics of the business in order for them to lead their teams. So yeah, distribution of leadership really through established metrics and being clear with their reports, or I don't like the term followers, but their reports in terms of what their team was expected to deliver and how that impacted on the business performance. In terms of transformational, so a lot more focus on behaviors, how they behaved, on supporting and trying to develop followers or reports. Emphasis on that individual consideration, on kind of that idealized influence. I act in this way, I get in at a certain time, I leave at a certain time, I'm out in the business, on the shop floor, engaging people. So very much, yeah, that what I would describe as that more traditional transformational model. I've chosen this picture because this particular one was, this is the way that I act, and it's based on this, and this is what I expect of others, and I explain to others. This is how we operate. So very much behavioural based rather than kind of specific processes. And the more pragmatic, there was certainly a group that really enjoyed the problem-solving aspect of the business, saw everything as a challenge. I particularly like this picture because, as you can see, not particularly well organized, not a lot of use of metrics at all, but this particular guy had grown a niche business through basically engaging all those in the business with problem solving. And he openly admit that was what he really enjoyed, engaging with customers and then engaging with the people within the business on the challenges of producing a bespoke product and solving some quite challenging construction issues with their product. So yeah, emphasis on engaging those in the business with some challenges presented to them, and then he and others that fell within this often took on, let's say, projects or products or delivery of a certain niche type areas, because others wouldn't, but they enjoyed the challenge of trying to produce a service or a product that other businesses just stayed away from. But they had the commercial sense to understand that and charged appropriately for it. And again, that graphic is trying to describe that it wasn't entirely a pragmatic, or didn't fit nicely into the pragmatic leadership theory style or box. There were other elements there. So I might have been a bit quick on that. I don't know. Certainly took longer when practicing, but more than happy to answer any questions and really welcome any comments. The references are there, so if anybody wanted those, more than happy to share this presentation with you all, and then obviously the references are there.
No, that was great. Thanks very much, Gary, for that. I neglected to mention in my intro, feel free as well to use the chat box for questions, anyone who would like to. I did mention you can raise your hand as well, or jump in if you'd like to ask a question. So have a think and get some in for Gary. I'll kick things off there, Gary. One of the interesting things that you mentioned there, just sort of as an aside that you didn't go into much, was the concept of place. And obviously that's sort of quite a new, sort of trendy leadership concept, and actually you also see it a lot in policy related stuff as well. Yeah. Obviously, and it was a theme. I don't know if you were at the keynotes on what was Sunday evening in the UK, and that it was spoken a lot about by Grace and Bridget, who were the two keynote speakers, in different ways. So I was wondering how that fits. Could you tell us a bit more about how that fits with high growth firms? Particularly, I was thinking within the context of the sort of leveling up localist agenda, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So I actually presented a paper on place at the last ISLC in UE a couple of years ago. So that was the kind of first paper I drafted. I'm trying to cut the data I've got into 3, possibly 4, and this is the third area. And so what I've done with the data for this one is basically taken the data and compared it to the traditional models, so mainly the normative models, and said, okay, well, does what I've seen fit with any of these normative models? And so that's what this paper is trying to do. The other paper is talking entirely about place, and where I mentioned there that context, what I found, particularly with some of the very high growth firms, they particularly understood place very well. And when I say that, what I mean by place, and I don't think this has been fully articulated yet, and as you say, it's quite new. So I describe place as the personal history of an individual. So not just their, as trait theorists would argue, their intelligence, their personality profile, but actually where have they learned, and I borrow Steve Kempster's phrase, and he argues that leaders have gone through an apprenticeship. They've learned to lead, not formally, but by growing up in a business. And then, so that legacy, I would call it personal history, is often an aspect of place, because to give some examples, one of the really high growth firms in the construction sector I just pointed to, he got to where he got to by working in various construction organizations and decided he wanted to focus on a very niche product in a niche market, because again, one of the things I point to about place, or within that place, is reflective practice. Again, from Alverson mainly, but others, Gibb and so on. So yeah, place in terms of personal history of the individual, place in terms of the geography, and understanding how their business fitted with regional supply and regional, as in Wales and as in UK. Some supplied only to the region, some UK and further afield. In terms of size, understanding that they could pitch for certain types of work, but not others, understanding their pricing in terms of size. So personal, geography, size, and then the place operating context, I would describe it, of the sector. So, the construction guys understood what the levels of pay were and how to ensure that they kept people. Ditto for the food, couple of food producers that I engaged with, the solicitors and legal and the accountants. All of the high growth firms understood what their sector or the kind of operating model within their sector, and how that impacted the organization, and how they could, as leaders, ensure that they kept the best people, by understanding that place context. Does that answer your questions? Sorry, I rambled a bit.
No, I think you very ably demonstrated that it is a very complicated thing to try and get your head around, and I think place gets thrown around as quite a simple concept a lot of the time, doesn't it? But yeah, once you drill into it, there are those complexities. Rachel's asked a couple of questions in the chat, which I'd like to get to. The first is a really good one. I'm sure you can see it, which is, do you think there's a need for more theories in this area, or is the subject too theory heavy as things stand currently?
I'd agree with the people like Keith Grint that says we can understand leadership through a framework rather than, I'd argue against the normative approach, rather than trying to publish another normative theory. And I think if you look at Anderson and Son, the 2017 and the Hock 2018 article, they list 40 odd post-transformational leadership theories. And whilst they theoretically different based on the author's arguments, when I tried to analyze them, when I analyzed the leaders' practices that I observed and asked them about against these multiple theories, they often overlapped. So I don't think there's any need for more theories. I know people have argued against and thrown away transformational leadership by and large, but I still think it's a very useful framework. But I agree again with the CLS authors that there isn't a best way to lead. Certainly when you take into account, and if you agree with the context argument, I mean, I particularly liked Ock's article because he said there's only three things in leadership: leaders, followers, and context. And you have to consider all three. You can't simply talk about one. So I don't know if that answers your question, Rachel.
Yeah, that's great. There's so pertinent to the research that I'm doing, which you'll see in a bit. So I found that really, really interesting.
Great.
Thanks, Rachel.
Sorry, I did see your paper. I'm looking forward to it. One of the aspects, emotional intelligence has been incorporated into a couple of the newer leadership theories, which smacks of the old wine in new bottles, doesn't it? So yeah, I suppose to answer your question, no, I don't think we need any new theories. We need more explanation of context and understanding of, I don't even know if you should use the word what makes you successful, because Daniel, you'd probably say in a third sector organization, these things are important. However, it doesn't mean you're going to be successful, because context comes into place there. So what I saw, another aspect of place, I would argue, is regional context and opportunity context. So some businesses were very successful, the high growth firms that I interviewed and followed, because they had adopted some slightly different practices in Wales, and others weren't doing that, and they stole a march and they grew quite quickly, and they developed a good reputation or brand for delivering against expectations, and particularly customers, and worked well with customers. So again, I would argue that's a good understanding of place, of where they're situated and what they need to do to ensure they serve what they would describe as their primary market.
Yeah, we've got maybe a minute just to I guess briefly discuss this final question that Rachel asked, which was about leadership styles. I'm wondering if the leadership styles do link to personality brackets trait more often in the SME sector, and because there's less emphasis on quote business school type leaders. Any comments on that, Gary, from Rachel?
I certainly agree with, I think it was Antonakis 2011, who kind of brought back traits and demonstrated empirically that they haven't gone away, and how can they? If a person is a leader, regardless of their formal or informal position, they do have traits. And I think Scott Taylor talked about it in actually the Bridget Carroll book, and again established, and I'd agree that intelligence and personality are very important, which I think is possibly one of the things Rachel might talk about in emotional intelligence. People are aware of, or the leaders that I found are very aware of what they like doing and what they don't like doing, and what they can, that level of self-awareness, and some of them very, very capable. And the one guy that I put up all of he's got metrics everywhere. And he said, I love this, and he basically analyzes, he says, I analyze everything to death. But what I'm trying to do is explain to people where we're going and how we're performing. So he's very self-aware of what he did. But he said it was very useful in communicating to the business and engaging with them on where they were successful, where they weren't.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks very much for that, Gary. Yeah, very interesting, and thanks very much for the discussion as well.